At 0400 station time, when the anchorage ran on its thinnest shift and the mess deck lights dimmed to save power, Sena Ovek sat alone in Observation Bay 4 and listened to people who did not know she existed. The distress net was not hers to monitor. She had no clearance for it, no seat on any response roster, no name on any crew manifest that mattered. But the receiver in Bay 4 had been left unlocked 11 months ago by an engineer who never came back to fix it, and Sena had decided, quietly, that this was not her problem to report. It was the one door on the whole station that had never once closed itself against her, and she had learned to be grateful for small, accidental mercies. Tonight the channel carried a mining tender 3 days out, venting atmosphere from a hull strike, for crew aboard, oxygen for 6 more hours if they sealed the aft section and stopped panicking long enough to do it. She listened to the captain's voice crack on the open channel, listened to a second voice, young, frightened, asking if they were going to die, listened to the first voice lie and say no, not today, and mean it hard enough that it almost became true. She had listened to hundreds of these. She had never once been allowed to answer one. The anchorage was a joint coalition disaster response station, a lattice of docking rings and drill bays built into the shell of an older processor, orbiting the debris-choked remains of a shattered moon called the Silt Belt. Its official purpose was training. Its unofficial purpose, as far as Sena had worked out in 11 months of watching, was proving that the coalition's newest and strangest members could be trusted with lives. She was the newest. She doubted, some nights, whether she counted as trusted with anything, including her own reflection. Her species called itself the Ilvan. The coalition's registry called them a conditional variance, a polite term for a threat under observation. Every sapient nervous system tested so far reacted to her presence the same way, a flood of certainty, sudden and total, that nothing was worth trying anymore. Not fight, not flight, just stillness, and the slow closing of a door somewhere behind the eyes. Her people called it the draw, because it drew the will out of a room the way a drain pulls water, quietly, without struggle, until there was nothing left standing in it. On her homeworld, 7 generations of predators had gone hungry chasing prey that simply stopped running. It was, Sena had been taught since childhood, an old and elegant mercy. Out here, among 109 species who had never asked for that mercy and did not want it, it read as something closer to a curse. She had a routine for nights like this one. Listen to the channel until the emergency resolved or didn't. Walk the long way back to her quarters, through the maintenance ring instead of the main corridors, where the traffic was thin enough that she rarely had to watch anyone flinch. Sleep for 4 hours, if sleep came at all. Report to the solo observation deck at 0800, where an instructor's voice would arrive through a headset from behind reinforced glass, close enough to grade her, far enough to never once share her air. The tender's captain got his people into the aft section with 4 minutes of air to spare. Sena exhaled, and only then noticed she'd been holding her breath the whole time, 300 light years from a ship she would never see and a crew who would never know her name. She stayed a while longer after the channel went quiet, the way she always did, letting the ordinary traffic of the coalition's rescue net wash over her, a supply convoy confirming a docking window, a training vessel logging a routine diagnostic, the small, unremarkable noise of a civilization that mostly, on any given night, managed to keep itself alive. It was, she had come to think, the only place in the anchorage where she felt like a citizen of anything at all, rather than a condition someone else's policy had been written to contain. Once, in her 4th month, she had keyed the transmit line open, just to see whether her voice would even carry. She hadn't said anything. She'd sat there with the channel live and her throat locked shut, and then she'd closed it again before anyone could ask who was listening, and she hadn't tried a second time since. The comm above the door chimed with the 2-tone pattern that meant a supervisor was approaching. She stood, smoothed the grey coverall the station issued to non-cadet personnel, the only uniform she was permitted to wear, and was 3 steps from the exit when the door opened from the other side. It was not a supervisor. It was a human she had never seen before, in a search and rescue trainee's black jacket, hair still damp from a transfer shuttle he'd clearly stepped off less than an hour ago, staring at the unlocked receiver with the particular focus of someone doing math in his head. "This isn't supposed to be live," he said, more to the console than to her. "It isn't supposed to be a lot of things," Sena said, and walked past him into the corridor before the 2-meter radius she carried everywhere could close around him and do what it always did. It didn't close. He hadn't moved back. She kept walking anyway, faster than she needed to, down toward the maintenance ring where the lights were dimmer and the eyes were fewer. She had learned, a long time ago, that the ones who didn't flinch on the first pass usually did on the second. It cost less to leave before that happened. His name, she found out by the end of the shift cycle because everyone on the Anchorage found out everything by the end of a shift cycle, was Cole Ames, transferred in from the Terran Auxiliary under the Joint Search and Rescue Exchange Program. Humanity had 3 seats on that program, total, across the whole coalition. He had taken one of them, apparently, for reasons nobody could get him to explain in more than a sentence. Sena did not seek him out. She told herself this 3 times on her way to the mess deck the next morning, which was itself evidence that she was thinking about it more than she wanted to. The Anchorage's mess deck sat under a long observation dome that looked out on the silt belt, a slow grey river of shattered rock lit by a distant orange sun. Sena's table was in the corner, past the recycling stack, chosen because it was the one table nobody else wanted. Table 9. She had eaten alone at Table 9 for 331 mornings, long enough that the cleaning drones had stopped bothering to reset the extra chairs around it. On the 332nd, Cole Ames sat down across from her with a tray of something that was probably meant to be eggs. She felt him arrive before she saw him. The field did that. She always knew when someone was close enough to feel it, because she could feel the shape of their fear pressing back against her own signal, like 2 tides meeting. His fear was there. She could read it in the stiffness of his shoulders, the too careful way he set the tray down instead of dropping it. But his hands weren't shaking, and he didn't look away. "You're the one who was watching the receiver," he said. "I'm the one who watches a lot of things. You're also the reason the seats around this table have been empty since before I got here." I did ask. He picked up a fork. Nobody would tell me why. Just that I shouldn't sit here. One of the Fen cadets actually apologized to me for not explaining. Like it was rude to let me find out on my own. That was good advice they gave you. Sit somewhere else. I've gotten a lot of good advice in my life. Statistically, I ignore most of it. He ate a forkful of the eggs, grimaced slightly, and kept eating anyway. These are terrible, by the way. Is that intentional? The synthesizers weren't calibrated for human enzymes when they built this station. I'm told the first 2 weeks are the worst. Good to know. I'm Cole. You already know my name. The whole station knows my name by now, I'd guess. Sena, he said. I know your name. I don't know anything else, which seems like a strange way to run a station full of people who are supposed to trust each other with their lives. She studied him the way she studied everyone, cataloguing the small, involuntary signs, the tightness around his eyes, the faint tremor his jaw was fighting to keep still. The field was working on him exactly as hard as it worked on everyone else. He was simply choosing, moment to moment, to keep sitting there anyway. You should be having trouble breathing right now, she said. Most people do, at this range. I am having trouble breathing. He set the fork down and met her eyes, and there was nothing performative in it, no bravado, just a plain fact stated out loud. I've been having trouble breathing since I walked in here. I decided that wasn't a good enough reason to stand back up. Sena had spent 11 months cataloguing the Coalition's 108 other species for any variation, any crack in the universal wall of the drawer. She had found none. She had stopped expecting to. Why, she said, and hated how small her voice came out, would you decide that? Cole considered the question with the same seriousness he'd given the eggs. Where I'm from, we spent most of our history as something's lunch, he said. Big cats. Things with more teeth than sense. We didn't survive because we stopped being afraid. We survived because being afraid never got to be the thing that decided what we did next. He shrugged, like it wasn't a strange thing to say to a stranger over a tray of bad eggs. I don't know if that's true for all of us. I know it's true for me. Figured somebody should test it properly instead of just avoiding you in the halls. Sena looked down at the grey paste in front of her, extruded that morning from the personal synthesizer she was required to use because the communal dispensers, station policy had ruled, could not be trusted around her without causing a disruption to meal service. You're the first person who's sat at this table in 11 months, she said. Then it's about time somebody did. He picked the fork back up. Tell me about the receiver. What were you listening to? She told him. It took longer than she expected, and somewhere in the telling, she noticed that her hands, which had been folded tight in her lap out of 11 months of habit, had loosened, and that a small, unfamiliar warmth had settled somewhere behind her ribs, in a place she'd assumed had gone permanently cold. Word travels fast on a station with 800 people and nowhere for gossip to go but in circles. By the second week, The fact that the human trainee ate lunch at Table 9 had become the single most discussed event on the Anchorage, discussed more than the incoming supply run, more than the promotion boards, more than the fact that a Doskari trade delegation had docked for what the official manifest called routine consultation and everyone else called something worth keeping an eye on. Sena noticed the delegation the way she noticed everything, from a distance, cataloguing. The Doskari were armored, low to the deck, moving in careful clusters through corridors that widened for them the way corridors widened for her, though for entirely different reasons: deference for the Doskari, avoidance for her. Their envoy, a senior trade director named Palorsic, had a habit of watching the search and rescue drills from the observation gallery with an attention that seemed disproportionate to a routine consultation. He never spoke to the cadets. He never spoke to Sena at all, not even the careful, distant courtesy the other observers extended. He simply watched, and made notes on a data slate she was never close enough to read. She asked one of the station's logistics officers, in passing, what a trade delegation could possibly want with a rescue academy's drill schedule. The officer, a Thrall cadet with no particular reason to be careful with her, shrugged and said the Doskari held the salvage rights across most of the silt belt, had held them for longer than the Anchorage itself had existed, and that trade envoys liked to keep an eye on anything that might, someday, change who got paid to clean up a wreck. It struck Sena at the time as an unremarkable answer, the kind of dull institutional fact that explained nothing and mattered to no one. She filed it away regardless, the way she filed everything, because 11 months of having nothing but observation to occupy her had taught her that the facts which seemed to matter least were often the ones worth remembering longest. Sena mentioned it to Cole exactly once, on the 4th week, during one of the joint calibration drills the station ran twice a cycle. He filed it away the way he filed most things she told him, without comment, without dismissal, which he had learned by then was simply how he listened. "You notice everything," he said. "Has anyone ever asked you why?" "Nobody's ever asked me anything," Sena said. "That's rather the point of the last 11 months." They were in the drill bay, a wide chamber built to simulate hull breaches, fires, and vacuum exposure under controlled conditions, and Sena had spent most of those 11 months watching this room from the observation gallery, never inside it. Cadets trained in pairs and squads. She trained, when she trained at all, alone, at odd hours, with an instructor who kept a full room's distance and gave feedback through a headset from behind reinforced glass. Cole had put in a request, 3 days after their first lunch, to be assigned a joint drill partner. The request had specified no name. The station's scheduling algorithm, either through coincidence or a quiet nudge from someone who understood exactly what Cole was asking for, had paired him with her. Commander Vashti Kaur, the Doskari officer who ran search and rescue certification for the station, had called them both into her office before approving it. "You understand what you're requesting," Vashti Kaur had said to Cole. Her voice carried the particular rasp of a Doskari speaking through a translator plate, each word arriving a half beat behind the motion of her mandibles. Cadet Ovek has been assigned solo observation status for the duration of her provisional enrollment. That status exists for a reason. "I understand the reason," Cole had said. "I'd like to test whether it still applies to me." "And if it does? If you find yourself unable to function in her presence during a live exercise, with lives depending on both of you, then I'll withdraw the request and you'll have your answer either way." He hadn't looked at Sena when he said it, which she'd appreciated more than she expected to. Isn't that the point of a drill? Finding out before it's real. Vashti Kaur had studied him for a long moment with all 4 of her eyes, an old Doskari habit that made most cadets deeply uncomfortable, and that Cole appeared, as far as Sena could tell, not to notice at all. "Approved," the commander had said. "Provisionally. I will be watching the results personally." In the drill bay now, running a simulated fire and breach scenario with 6 other cadets giving them both a wide, careful berth, Sena found herself doing something she hadn't done in 11 months, speaking during a live exercise, not into a headset for a distant grader, but out loud, to a partner 3 feet away, who turned toward her voice instead of away from it. "Left corridor floods with smoke at the 90-second mark," she said. "It always does. The scenario script doesn't vary the timing, only the density. You've watched this one before." "I've watched all of them before. From the gallery. It's the only seat they'd give me." Cole adjusted the angle of his approach without breaking stride. "Not anymore," he said, and it wasn't a promise, exactly, just a statement of fact, the way he said most things, and Sena found she believed it anyway. That had been 3 weeks ago. She caught herself thinking something she had not let herself think in 11 months, that she was, for the first time since arriving at the anchorage, being watched not to see if she would fail, but to see how well she could do. There was a thing Sena carried that she had not told Cole about, not in 3 weeks of lunches at Table 9, not in 3 weeks of drills where they'd learned to move around each other without speaking, her calling the angles she'd catalogued from months of solo observation, him laying suppressive smoke and covering the approaches her isolation had never let her practice in a team. It was a data chip, old Ilvan manufacture, worn smooth from being carried in a pocket for longer than she wanted to count. On it was a recording, 40 years old, made by a group of Ilvan who had called themselves wardens. She told him about it on the 5th week, in the observation bay, at the same unlocked receiver where they'd first met, because it felt like the kind of thing that belonged there. Outside the narrow viewport, the silt belt turned slow and grey under the orange sun, and somewhere below the deck plating, a maintenance drone hummed along its rounds, the only other sound in the room besides their voices and the low static hiss of an empty channel. 40 years ago, before the coalition had even heard of us properly, there was a colony fire on one of our outer settlements, she said. A group of my people went in to pull survivors out. They thought the draw wouldn't matter, that instinct would override it, that people trapped in a burning building would fight to live regardless of what field was pressing on them. Did it work? For a while. Then the field built up, too many Ilvan in too small a space, all of it compounding, and the survivors stopped fighting. All of them. Just sat down in the smoke and waited to die, because some part of every one of their brains had decided it was pointless to do anything else. Her voice was flat, the way it went when she was working hard to keep it that way. The wardens got 12 people out of 40. It was considered, at the time, a triumph. A worse fire had been prevented. And it was also the reason my people withdrew from every attempt at contact with anyone else for the next 3 decades. We decided the only responsible thing to do with ourselves was disappear. Cole was quiet for a moment. That's not why you carry the recording, though. Not just the history. She hadn't told anyone that part. She turned the chip over once in her fingers before she answered. One of the wardens was my mother's sister, she said. She recorded a message afterward, for whoever came next, whoever tried again someday to prove we could be more than a hazard. I've listened to it more times than I could count. She didn't play it for him. Some things, she'd decided long ago, were meant to be carried rather than shared, at least at first. She says something on it I think about constantly. That the field isn't the failure. The failure was believing there was nothing to be done about it except hide. What was it like, Cole asked, growing up somewhere everyone around you had the same field? Did it feel different? Or was it just normal, the way anything is normal if it's all you've ever known? Sena considered the question longer than she expected to need. It was quiet, she said finally. Ilvan settlements are quiet in a way I don't think any other species truly understands until they've stood in one. Nobody startles anyone. Nobody raises their voice without meaning to be heard specifically. We grew up learning to read each other through everything except the field itself, because the field was just weather, background, the same for everyone in the room. It wasn't until I left home that I understood what it did to people who didn't grow up inside it. On Ilvan ground, I was ordinary. Out here, I found out what I actually was. She turned the chip over once more before continuing. I used to think that meant something was wrong with me specifically. It took a long time to understand it meant something was simply true about all of us, and that the two things aren't the same. So you came out here to do something about it. I came out here to prove that 12 people surviving a fire that should have killed 40 of them wasn't a tragedy. It was the beginning of an answer nobody finished working out. She looked at him, and something in her chest loosened slightly, an old weight shifting for the first time in longer than she wanted to admit. I haven't told anyone that. About my aunt. About the recording. Because you're the first person who asked what I wanted instead of what was wrong with me. She put the chip away. Don't make me regret it. He didn't say anything clever back. He just nodded, once, the same small motion he'd used the first day at the mess table, and something about the plainness of it made her believe, for the first time in 11 months, that trust might be a thing she was allowed to have again. Neither of them noticed, through the observation bay's narrow viewport, the shape of a Doskari courier drone pausing outside the hull seam 2 decks below, running a slow, deliberate scan of the station's internal drill schedule before moving on. The message from the Terran Auxiliary's liaison office arrived on Cole's data slate on the 6th week, marked priority, requesting his presence at 0600, before the morning meal cycle even began. Commodore Ilse Renner ran humanity's small delegation on the Anchorage from an office 2 decks above the mess hall, a room that still smelled faintly of the packing crates it had arrived in. She did not offer Cole a seat. "You understand the position you're putting your government in," she said. It wasn't a question. "I understand the position I'm putting myself in, Commodore. I filed the paperwork under my own name. That's not how it reads from where I sit." Renner tapped her slate, and a report scrolled past too fast for Cole to read more than a few words of it. "Humanity has 3 seats on this exchange program. 3. We fought for them for 2 years before the Council granted them, because half the coalition still isn't sure we are worth the air we breathe on their stations. Every human cadet out here is a data point in an argument that hasn't finished being made. You've decided to spend your data point on a species the coalition has spent a century keeping in a box. I've decided to test whether the box needs to be that small. That's not your decision to make. That's the Council's. With respect, Commodore, the Council made its decision with incomplete information. Nobody had ever tested whether a species outside the sample set might react differently. I'm not defying the ruling. I'm generating the data nobody bothered to collect." Renner studied him for a long moment, and Cole recognized the look, because he'd seen a version of it on Sena's face more than once, the particular weariness of someone who has had to explain, too many times, why a reasonable thing is being treated as a provocation. "If this goes wrong," Renner said, "if you're injured, if a mission fails because of your association with her, it will not be read as one cadet's misjudgment. It will be read as evidence that humanity's judgment cannot be trusted with a coalition seat. Every human on this program will carry that. Every human petitioning for coalition rights for the next decade will carry that. And if it goes right, then you'll have done something considerably larger than pass a certification track." Renner set the slate down. "I'm not ordering you to withdraw, Sub-Lieutenant. I don't have the authority, and frankly, I'm not certain I'd use it if I did. I am telling you that you are no longer just gambling with your own career. Sit with that before your next drill." "One more thing," Renner said, as Cole reached the door. "The Doskari trade delegation has requested a copy of every joint drill schedule involving Cadet Ovek, citing routine oversight interest in coalition training standards. I've approved it, because refusing would draw more attention than granting it. I'd like you to keep that in mind. Not every audience in this station is watching to see you succeed." Cole left the office with the weight of it settled somewhere behind his sternum, heavier than he let on when he found Sena an hour later in the drill bay's equipment room, checking the seals on a set of rescue harnesses with the meticulous, repetitive focus of someone who needed her hands busy. "You look like you had a bad morning," she said, without looking up. "Had a conversation with my Commodore. About you. About us training together." He picked up a harness and started checking the buckle himself, more to have something to do than because it needed doing twice. "She's not wrong to be worried. If this goes badly, it doesn't just cost me." Sena set her harness down. "Do you want to stop?" "No." He said it fast enough that neither of them mistook it for anything but the truth. "I want you to know what it costs, is all. I don't think you've ever had anyone tell you the price before they paid it. Everyone's just quietly avoided you and called it caution. I'd rather be honest about the bill." Something in her chest did the thing it had started doing more often since he sat down at table 9, loosened, unclenched, made room for something she didn't yet have a good name for. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me instead of just deciding quietly and letting me find out later. That's rather the whole point of sitting at the table, isn't it?" He picked the harness back up, checked the last buckle, and set it on the rack with the others. "Come on. Ristel's waiting. We've got a drill to run, and apparently I've got a data point to generate." The 7th week live fire evaluation was the largest joint exercise the Anchorage ran that cycle, a full-scale simulated colony evacuation staged in the drill bay's largest chamber, with holographic terrain, adaptive hazard systems, and a panel of observing officers that included, for the first time, Commander Vashti Kaur in person and, seated a careful distance behind her, Director Pel Orsic of the Doskari trade delegation, whose presence at a training evaluation nobody had quite explained. To Cole's satisfaction. Sena had never been assigned to a full squad evaluation before. She had never been assigned to anything before, beyond solo observation. When her name appeared on the roster next to Cole's, printed plainly among 5 other cadets as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world, she read it twice to be sure it wasn't a mistake. It wasn't. It was, she understood later, Vashti Kaur's decision, made deliberately, made to be seen being made. The scenario was a collapsed habitat dome, 12 simulated civilians scattered through unstable wreckage, a countdown clock representing dwindling life support, and an adaptive hazard system designed to punish predictable squad tactics. Sena had spent 11 months learning this room from the outside. She knew its blind spots the way she knew the sound of her own breathing. "There," she said, 20 seconds in, pointing past the obvious route through the main corridor toward a maintenance shaft nobody else had flagged. The primary path collapses at the 90-second mark. It's scripted that way every time to punish squads that go in loud. The squad leader, a Fen cadet named Ristel who had spent the first 6 weeks of Sena's enrollment giving her a wide, careful berth in every hallway they'd shared, hesitated for exactly 1 second before saying, "Confirmed. Ames, Ovek, you're on the side route. Rest of the squad, main corridor, staggered entry on my mark." It was the first time anyone on the station had used her name as an order instead of a warning. They moved through the maintenance shaft while the rest of the squad drew the hazard system's attention through the main corridor, and Sena called every turn from months of watching this scenario play out for other cadets, and Cole moved beside her without flinching. Laying down cover at the junction, she flagged a half-second before the adaptive system reacted to them, and for 11 minutes and 40 seconds, the drill bay ran exactly the way a drill was supposed to run. Hard, controlled, and successful. Partway through, a holographic support beam gave way ahead of them, dropping a wall of simulated debris across the corridor exactly where Sena had predicted, and instead of the panic she still half expected from herself after 11 months of solitary drills, she found something closer to satisfaction, the clean, quiet pleasure of a problem solved before it became a crisis. Near the midpoint of the run, the adaptive hazard system threw a variable neither of them had drilled for, a secondary hologram, projected mid-corridor, of a panicking Fen civilian who refused the standard extraction call. Sena, who had spent 11 months studying every recorded response the system had ever generated, recognized the branch instantly. "It wants us to slow down and negotiate," she said. "It's testing whether we'll waste 90 seconds coaxing a scripted panic response instead of just carrying the target. So we carry the target. We carry the target." Cole scooped the hologram simulated weight up without breaking stride, grunting under a mass the system had helpfully rendered as considerably heavier than it needed to be. "For the record," he said, breathing hard, "if this were real, I would absolutely negotiate first." Julie noted for the report. "You could have told me you were always this good at this," he added, a few strides later, once the corridor opened out again. "Nobody ever asked me to be good at anything with someone else standing next to me." She kept moving, counting the seconds against the dwindling clock. "There's a difference." They pulled all 12 simulated survivors clear with 4 minutes to spare on the clock. It was, according to the evaluation board's own historical data, the fastest full clear in the drill's 3-year history. In the observation gallery afterward, Vashti Kaur reviewed the telemetry twice before speaking. "Cadet Ovek," she said, "your route selection saved this squad approximately 6 minutes against the standard approach. I've had a great deal of time to study the room, Commander." "So it would seem." Vashti Kaur's mandibles clicked in a pattern Sena had learned, over 11 months of careful cataloguing, to associate with something close to approval. "I am revising your training status effective immediately. You will be assigned to standard squad rotation going forward, pending final certification review." It was the closest thing to a victory Sena had been handed in 11 months, and for one entire evening, walking back through Corridor 7 with Cole beside her and the crowd parting around them out of old habit rather than fresh terror, she let herself believe the hardest part might already be behind her. Behind them, in the observation gallery, Director Pel Orsic remained seated long after the other observers had filed out, watching the empty drill bay with the stillness of someone recalculating a number that had just changed in a way he did not like. They marked the promotion the only way either of them knew how to mark anything, with a tray of bad food at table 9, though for once the mess deck around them had a different texture to it. A pair of Thrall cadets nodded to Sena on their way past. Ristel stopped long enough to say, gruffly, that the side route had been the right call, and that he'd been wrong to keep her off full rotation for as long as he had, and then left before either of them could make it into a larger conversation than he intended. "That's the 4th person today who's spoken to you first," Cole said, once Ristel was out of earshot. "I've been counting too. Feels different, doesn't it? Being seen instead of avoided. It feels like waiting for the other version to come back." She turned her cup of recycled water in slow circles on the table, watching the light catch the rim. 11 months teaches a person not to trust the good week. Cole considered that for a moment, then reached into his jacket and set something on the table between them, a small, battered data reader, the kind issued to every cadet for reviewing training footage. I've got an hour before the evening briefing. You mentioned a recording once. 40 years old. Your aunt. He didn't push it further than that, just left the offer sitting on the table the way he'd left everything else since the first morning, plain and unhurried. You don't have to. I just thought I'd ask instead of waiting for you to decide. I already know. Sena looked at the reader for a long moment. She thought about the 11 months of carrying the chip and never once taking it out in front of another living person, coalition, or otherwise. She thought about the phrase her aunt had recorded, the one she turned over some nights like a stone worn smooth from handling. She took the chip from her pocket and set it into the reader before she could talk herself out of it. The voice that came through was younger than Sena remembered from the last time she'd played it, though of course it wasn't. It was exactly the same recording it had always been. It was Sena who had grown older around it. Her aunt's voice was steady, tired in the particular way of someone speaking into a silence she didn't expect anyone to answer for a long time. 12 of 40 is not a victory, the recording said. I want whoever hears this to understand that clearly, before anyone tells you otherwise. But 12 of 40 is not nothing, either. We went in believing the field made us useless in a crisis, and we came out having proven it only some of the time, under conditions no one had bothered to study. The mistake was not attempting the rescue. The mistake was deciding, afterward, that the correct lesson was to never attempt one again. Whoever you are, whenever you hear this, the door isn't closed because it can't be opened. It's closed because we were too frightened of what it cost the first time to try the second. The recording ended. Cole didn't say anything right away, and Sena was grateful for it, because she needed the silence to put her face back together. She sounds like she'd have liked you, Cole said finally. She never met a human. Never met anyone outside the Ilvan settlements, as far as I know. Doesn't matter. I still think she would have. He slid the reader back across the table to her. Thank you for playing it. I know that wasn't a small thing. It wasn't, Sena agreed, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that saying so out loud didn't cost her anything at all. The emergency call came in 9 days later, and it was not a drill. A colony transport, the Holden Reach, carrying 211 passengers on a return run from a mining settlement on the edge of the silt belt, had clipped an uncharted debris fragment and lost its port hull section to explosive decompression. 41 confirmed casualties in the first 90 seconds. The remaining survivors sealed into 3 isolated sections with failing life support, no working shuttle bay, and a ship structure groaning toward a second, larger collapse. The Anchorage response wing scrambled within 4 minutes. Sena's name was on the deployment roster, alongside Cole's, alongside the same squad she trained with 9 days earlier. It was the first live emergency of her enrollment. It would also, though nobody knew it yet, be the last day the Coalition's ruling on the Ilvan stood unchanged. The transfer shuttle ride-out took 11 minutes. Sena spent it running the Holden Reach schematic in her head, memorizing choke points, calculating decompression math, doing the only thing she'd ever learned to do with fear, turning it into work. Around her, the rest of the squad checked their harnesses in silence, and for the first time in her life, nobody moved their seat away from hers when the shuttle banked. They arrived to a ship in slow structural failure, its emergency lighting flickering along buckled corridors, its remaining survivors packed into a cargo hold that had become, by grim necessity, a shelter. 211 people had become, by the time the rescue teams cut their way in, 149 confirmed alive, and every one of them was in various stages of panic that was actively working against the extraction. Sena's squad took the outer approach, cutting through a collapsed maintenance corridor toward the 4th evacuation route while Ristel's team worked the main breach. The going was slow. Twice they had to reroute around sections that had buckled past any safe passage, and each time, Sena's months of solo study paid for itself in seconds saved. Seconds that on a normal drill would have meant nothing, and here meant the difference between a clean approach and a dead end. You're doing that thing again, Cole said at one junction, watching her pause for half a second before choosing a direction with total certainty. What thing? The thing where you already know the answer before you've finished asking the question. I had 11 months with nothing to do but memorize failure points. This is the first time any of it has been useful to someone besides me. She kept moving. Her voice, over the comm, had none of the flatness it carried in the mess hall. Out here, with a job in front of her, it had gone sharp and clear, the voice of someone finally doing the thing she had spent a year training in isolation to do. Left at the next junction. The support strut there is rated to hold another 11 minutes. We have time, if we don't waste it. They reached the fourth evacuation route with the countdown clock reading 6 minutes and change, enough of a margin that for the length of one held breath, Sena allowed herself to believe this rescue might simply be difficult, and not something worse. That was when the second failure happened. The Anchorage Rescue Shuttle Bay reported a total loss of remote telemetry from the extraction team's suits at the same moment the Holden reached internal emergency systems, which should have been slave to the rescue team's override codes, locked instead into an unresponsive fail-safe state that sealed 3 of the 4 evacuation routes. That's not damage, Sena said, reading the diagnostic feed off her wrist unit as the squad worked to breach the 4th route by hand, sparks scattering off the hatch in bright, useless arcs. Damage doesn't lock a fail-safe this cleanly. Someone wrote this. Cole was beside her, cutting through a jammed access panel with a plasma torch, sweat cutting tracks through the grime on his face. Sabotage. Here. On a live rescue. On this rescue specifically. Sena's mind was already running the calculation she didn't want to finish. If the 4th route fails too, everyone left in their hold is trapped behind a bulkhead that's rated for 6 more minutes before the whole section goes. The comm crackled. Ristel's voice, tight with strain. We've got 109 people in their hold and the 4th route just started venting. We are not going to cut through in time. Sena looked at the bulkhead, then at the crowd of frightened, half-suffocated survivors she could see through the narrow viewport, packed shoulder to shoulder, already beginning to surge toward the failing hatch in a panic that would only make the venting worse, would trample the ones near the front, would turn a structural failure into a stampede inside a coffin. For 11 months, every instinct trained into her had told her to stay back, to keep her distance, to be a controlled variable rather than an unpredictable one. Every rule the Coalition had ever written about her existed to keep the thing she carried inside her as far from a crisis as possible. Sena. Cole's voice, close beside her, steady despite the sweat and the strain already written across his face. Whatever you're about to decide, I want you to know I'm not going anywhere. Whatever this costs, it doesn't cost you alone. Not this time. She thought of her aunt's recording. The failure wasn't the field. The failure was believing there was nothing to be done about it except hide. Cole, she said, get everyone else back. Now. Full retreat to the outer corridor. What are you doing? The thing I came out here to test. She had spent her whole life holding it in, the way a hand holds a door shut against a storm. Every day at the Anchorage, every meal at Table 9, every corridor she'd walked through alone, had been an exercise in containment, in making herself smaller, quieter, less felt. She let it go. It did not erupt the way panic erupts. It moved the way water moves through a crack, quiet and total and absolute, a wave of certainty rolling out from her in every direction. Stop. There is no use fighting this. Be still. Cole staggered but did not fall, one hand braced against the corridor wall, his breath coming in short, controlled bursts through gritted teeth, blood already starting at one nostril from the strain of a body fighting a message it was never built to withstand. He held his ground 3 meters back, exactly where she'd told him to go, watching her with an expression that was not fear of her but fear for her, which was a distinction she had never in her life been given the chance to notice before. On the other side of the hatch, the stampede stopped. 109 people, packed into a failing hold with seconds of structural integrity left, simply stopped pushing. Stopped shouting. Stood, or sat, or sank to the deck, held for one long, terrible, silent moment inside a stillness Sena had spent her entire life being told was the worst thing her people could do to a room. It was also, in that exact moment, the only thing that kept 109 frightened bodies from crushing each other against a hatch that finally, with 3 seconds to spare, blew open under the rescue team's cutting charge. The extraction that followed was the strangest of Sena's life. She held the field at a careful, controlled edge, not the crushing wave she'd let loose to break the panic, but a thin, steady pressure, just enough to keep the crowd calm and orderly as the rescue teams pulled them through the breach one section at a time. No crush, no chaos, 109 people evacuated in 4 minutes flat through a gap that should have taken 20. Somewhere near the end of the line, a small child, no more than 6 years old by human reckoning, was passed hand to hand through the breach and set down on the deck plating in front of Sena, too dazed and too calm under the field's thin edge to be properly frightened of her. The child looked up, blinked once, and reached out to touch the sleeve of Sena's suit, the way a child touches something new and mildly interesting rather than something to fear. It lasted less than a second before a rescue worker swept the child onward. Sena carried the memory of it anyway, all the way back to the anchorage, tucked in beside the weight of everything else. Halfway through the extraction, a secondary tremor ran through the Holden Reach's hull, a groan of stressed metal loud enough to carry through 3 decks, and for one heart-stopping second the thin, controlled edge of Sena's field wavered, the crowd on the other side of the breach beginning to stir, to remember they were afraid, to start pushing again. She pulled the field back into focus with a force of will that left her vision swimming at the edges, and the calm settled back over the hold like a hand smoothing a wrinkled sheet. Cole, still braced against the corridor wall 3 meters back, called out the tremor source to the extraction team before she'd even finished steadying herself. A secondary strut giving way 2 decks up, contained, not a threat to the hold, information she needed and did not have the spare attention left to gather herself. It was, she would think later, the clearest evidence yet of what the two of them were becoming to each other. Not simply a cadet who could stand near her, but a partner who filled in the gaps her concentration couldn't reach. By the time the last survivor cleared the hatch and the section sealed itself behind them, Sena's knees had given out. Cole was there before she hit the deck, catching her under one arm, his own hand shaking so badly he nearly dropped her anyway, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing left in her voice to say it with. The return shuttle ride was quiet in a different way than the ride-out had been. Sena drifted in and out of a grey, exhausted half-sleep, aware distantly of Cole's shoulder against hers, of the low murmur of Ristel's voice on the comm confirming the final survivor count to the anchorage, of 149 names being read into a record that, an hour earlier, nobody had expected to survive intact. On the anchorage, 40 minutes later, in the same medical bay where Cole's nervous system had first been mapped in disbelieving detail 9 days earlier, Dr. Amal Ruscovy ran her third full diagnostic pass over Sena's readings with an expression that had shifted, somewhere in the last 20 minutes, from clinical alarm to something closer to quiet astonishment. Your field output during the extraction was nearly 4 times the baseline we recorded during the sabotage incident review, Ruscovy said, more to the display than to either of them. By every model I have, that should have put you into neurological shock. It very nearly did. What kept you conscious through the second surge was, as far as I can tell, deliberate control. You were modulating output in real time, under duress, which is not something any prior study of your species has ever documented as possible. She looked up, silver fur still faintly ruffled with the leftover tension of the last hour. I would very much like to understand how. Later, Sena said, from the scanning bed, her voice a thin rasp. Ask me again once I've slept. Cole sat in the chair beside her, a bandage taped under his nose, an intravenous stabilizer of his own feeding into one arm at Ruscovy's insistence. He had not left the medical bay once since they'd been brought in, not for the debrief, not for the meal cycle, not for the commendation officer who had come by to take his statement and left again when he refused to give it anywhere but at Sena's side. You went further than you did on the Holden Reach corridor, he said quietly, once Ruscovy had stepped away to review another display. During the extraction. I felt it get worse before it got better. I know. I felt you feel it. She turned her head against the scanning bed's thin pillow to look at him. I am sorry. I didn't have a way to warn you it was coming. Wasn't asking for an apology. He reached over, careful of the foreline, and set his hand loosely over hers, the same plain, unhurried gesture he'd offered her a dozen small ways since the first morning at Table 9. Just wanted you to know I felt it, and I stayed anyway, and I'd do it again tomorrow if it came to that. Figured that was worth saying out loud instead of just meaning it quietly. Commander Vashti Kaur stood over a secondary diagnostic display showing a very different kind of data. The Holden Reach's emergency system logs, recovered intact from the ship's black box, showing a remote override signal that had originated, with a level of access only one entity aboard the anchorage possessed, from a terminal registered to the Doskari trade delegation. Director Orsic anticipated that a failed rescue involving your species would end the integration question permanently, Vashti Kaur said to Sena, who lay on the scanning bed with an 4-line feeding stabilizing fluid into one arm and Cole in the chair beside her, refusing to leave despite 3 separate requests from the medical staff. The Silk Belt salvage concessions have been under Doskari control for 40 years. A certified Ilvan Rescue Corps, capable of clearing Rex's own teams take 3 times as long to reach, would have made a significant portion of that monopoly obsolete within a decade. He did not anticipate that you would use the draw to save the people he intended it to kill. I didn't do it for the vote, Sena said, her voice a thin rasp. I know. That is precisely why it will work. The Coalition Integration Council convened an emergency session 6 days later, and for once in the history of Ilvan contact, the data on the table was not a fear response chart. It was a rescue log, 109 names, all of them alive, all of them recorded as having survived a structural failure that should have killed most of them, saved in part by the very field their species had spent a century being quarantined for. Sena was not in the chamber for the vote. She spent the day in the medical bay under observation, and then, once released, in the drill bay's equipment room, doing the small, ordinary work of checking harness seals, because her hands needed something to do that wasn't waiting. Dr. Ruscovy stopped by twice that day to run follow-up scans, and left both times with more questions than answers and a request, gently but firmly refused a second time, to study the draw's controlled application in greater depth. "When I've slept properly," Sena told her, "and not before." Ristel found her there too, midway through the afternoon, standing in the equipment room doorway with the particular awkwardness of someone who had rehearsed what he wanted to say and lost most of it on the walk over. 809 people are filing a commendation request, he said. For you specifically. Half of them didn't even know what species had done it until the debrief. They just knew somebody had made the fear stop long enough for them to get out. He shifted his weight, crest flickering through a pattern Sena had learned, over the last weeks, to read as discomfort with sincerity rather than displeasure. "I gave you a wide berth for 6 weeks because that's what everyone did, and I never once asked myself if it was fair. I'm not going to pretend that's a small thing to have gotten wrong. I just wanted you to hear me say it before the council makes it official and everyone starts saying it for the easy reasons instead of the real one. Thank you, Ristel. Don't thank me. Just keep being difficult to underestimate." He left before the moment could stretch any longer than either of them wanted it to, which Sena had come to understand, in her own quiet way, was simply how Ristel said things that mattered to him. That evening, she was where she always was during the station's quiet hours, in observation bay 4, at the unlocked receiver nobody had ever bothered to fix, listening. The door opened behind her. She didn't need to turn around to know it was Cole. She could feel the particular shape of him now, familiar instead of alarming, the tide that no longer felt like an intrusion. "They passed it," he said. "Full provisional membership review, effective this cycle. Vashti Corps putting together a joint rescue certification track. Ilvan and human paired teams, first of its kind." He sat down in the chair beside her, the one that had never once been occupied in 11 months before him. Director Orsiks being extradited to a Doskari tribunal. Turns out the trade delegation was less interested in fear stability than in keeping salvage rights to a debris field a working Ilvan Rescue Corps would have made obsolete. Money, in the end. It usually is, when you dig far enough. And Commodore Renner? Your career, the one she warned you about. Funny thing about generating good data, Cole said, with the faint edge of a smile. Turns out it's hard to call it a misjudgment when the council's using it to justify a policy change. She's not thrilled about the paperwork. She'll live. Sena said nothing for a long moment, listening to the low static hum of the open channel, the quiet, ordinary sound of nothing happening, no emergency, no distress call, just the wide dark net of the coalition holding still. "I used to sit in this room because it was the only place I could feel useful without anyone having to look at me," she said. "I think I need a different reason now." "Got one in mind." "I was thinking," she said, "that a channel like this shouldn't have to be monitored by someone hiding in a bay nobody remembers to lock. Vashti Corps mentioned a permanent listening post. Somebody's going to have to run it." Cole smiled, the first easy, unguarded smile she'd seen from him in 6 weeks of near-death and paperwork. "You'd be good at that." "I know," Sena said, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she said it without flinching either. She thought, briefly, of the data chip still carried in her pocket, of her aunt's voice, 40 years old and still waiting for someone to finish the sentence it had started. She had not played the recording for anyone yet. She thought, for the first time, that she might, eventually, when the moment felt like the right one instead of a confession. The channel crackled. A distant supply convoy, 3 sectors out, running routine check INS, nothing urgent, nothing that needed either of them. They listened anyway, together, the way people who intend to keep listening for a long time do. Somewhere in the low static between transmissions, Sena found herself thinking about the version of herself who had sat in this same chair 11 months ago, keying open a channel she didn't have the courage to speak into. She thought about how little it would have taken, back then, for someone to simply sit down across the room from her the way Cole had sat down across a mess table, and how long 11 months could feel when nobody did. She did not resent the length of it anymore, not tonight. She only intended, from here forward, to make sure it took less time for the next person who needed it. "You're thinking loudly again," Cole said, without looking over. "I'm thinking that I finally have a reason to key this channel open and actually say something into it, instead of just listening." "So say something." Sena reached forward, keyed the transmit line live for the first time in 11 months, and after moments' hesitation that lasted exactly as long as it needed to and not a second longer, she did. Tomorrow morning at 7:40, 2 cadets would walk through Corridor 7 side by side, and the crowd would still part around them from all habit, because habits like that do not break in a single vote or a single rescue. But it would take a little less time to close again behind them than it had the day before, and the day after that, a little less still. The draw had not changed. It never would. What had changed was the room around it. One rescued life, one open channel, one person who refused to walk away, at a time.